What if Bella was never saved by Edward? Fanfiction Late Night Audiobook, Part 3. So let's get into dreams. For the first time since this whole thing started, I had lied. Even though it was necessary for the circumstances, it bothered me. Somehow, while settling into my new reality, I had begun to see Jamaica's life and history as mine, but the truth was that I was an interloper. It dawned on me that although unintentionally, since that first day, I had been lying to everyone. A lie of omission is still a lie. This statement circled my thoughts as I walked home. By the time I unlocked the front door, my thoughts were even more snarled than they had been all day. I didn't want to keep lying to these kind people, but I also didn't want to be sent to get a psychological evaluation. I didn't know what to do. Either way, I was betraying my values, and thus myself. Oddly, the whole time walking home I had the sense of being watched. It wasn't foreboding, so much as strange, as it seemed to me like it was an angel watching over me. Angel or not, entering the house and closing the door was a sweet relief. I had enough strange things in my life to add any more. Devastation arose when the feeling of the angel watching me returned upon me entering my bedroom. I just couldn't take the possibility of a guardian angel after everything else. My world was too strange and hard already to add some supernatural element to it. Please leave me alone, I mentally pleaded, and poof, just like that, as if my imaginary stalker could hear my plea, the sense disappeared. The only reasonable conclusion was that Forks was bad for my mental health. First it had been body snatching, and then imaginary stalkers. With at least half of the impossible no longer present, I settled down to do my homework. Quileute and English, as there was an essay, were the only subjects left to finish when Mrs. White came home with the boys. Putting away my books, I went downstairs and spent time with them, while she made dinner. We were sitting down to eat at the table when Mrs. White mentioned, "I talked to Sue and we're going to the res tomorrow, so we can do your hair on Sunday." "Thank you," I told her, wanting to stay on her good side. She eyed me sidewise, but said nothing. Dinner was another amazing rice and beans dish with bits of things I didn't recognize. There was something about the way she cooked that allowed there to almost be a tangible flavor of love. Mr. White came home later than usual and informed us that he got caught stuck on a call, whatever that meant. Charlie had never explained when he got late, and Renee's stories never made sense. His words were unusual for me, but gave me a warm tingling feeling in my belly. "I wasn't too late for stories?" he asked, sitting at the table, while Mrs. White, who had gone to the stove, returned with a dish full of food. "You're good," Mrs. White answered. "We were about to set up." "Should I do the dishes?" I wondered, wanting to be helpful. She looked at me like she was suspicious, which then morphed into a puzzlement, like she didn't recognize me. "Nah, baby girl." Then she exchanged a heated look with Mr. White before she maneuvered the boys into the living room, and Mr. White grabbed his bowl of dinner while telling me, "Well, come on." As if shocked with static, I jumped from my seat and followed him, a bit nervous. "Great Papa and the Bear," Damien requested at his top volume over and over in a loop. "The Spirit Wolves and the Strange Cold Ones," Martin requested also at top volume and with the same woodpecker repetition. Smiling at them, as they were precious in their enthusiasm, I placed myself on a two-person sofa, clearly well used, that was against the wall and faced Mr. White. He had one boy on each side of him, while Mrs. White had placed herself in one of the recliners. Their downstairs was designed very similarly to Charlie's house, except a larger kitchen, where they also placed their dining table, and a slightly smaller living room, by the looks of it. The glaring difference was that their room had no TV. Instead of a sofa and two comfy chairs facing the wall where the television hung, they had a three-seater, two comfy chairs, and the two-seater in a circle with an oval weaved rug on the floor. The rug looked handmade and native, of which tribe I wasn't sure. It was easily 10 feet long and 4 feet wide, with a look about it that it was a labor of love. The connection of items to history and meaning was one of the things I used to adore about being at Billy's house when I was a little girl. I had very few memories of my visits there, but there were a few snippets of Mrs. Black telling me the history of a few items. It had created a longing within me to have such a meaningful life, probably since Renee had no meaning to the items she owned other than it called to me. Once more I found myself envious of Jamaica and what she had in her life. Mr. White looked over at Mrs. White and mouthed both. She nodded and smiled before looking over at me with a calculating gaze for a few seconds. For a few seconds more, I waited for her to change her mind, but then she schooled her features into a neutral expression, saying nothing more. Despite her silence, her eyes looked like she was concerned about me hearing these stories. It reminded me of how the tribal elders' features had appeared when I was visiting and tribal legends were mentioned. Certainly as I had grown older, they had limited my exposure to the tribe's myths. Mr. White's tone was stern and serious when with a slow articulation told the boys, spirit wolves and the strange cold ones first. Both boys celebrated, so they must have known his words meant that they were both getting their wish. His voice grew deeper, as he began. It was easy to get lost in the world he created. He would pause and alter the pitch of his voice to create an engaging, yet scary tale. He was a masterful storyteller. Long ago the tribe was blessed with protectors. These spirit warriors took the shape of a wolf, but they were no natural wolves. These protectors of the Quileute nation had canines as long as a foot and were stronger than any diamond. No creature could defeat them. They were men of the tribe who had wives and children. Other nations knew of the power of the Quileute protectors. Some nations moved away, believing the protectors caused evil to darken their doors, while others stayed close and formed strong trading relationships with the Quileute nation. To pale faces they appeared as no different than any other Quileute. To the evil ones, to the cold ones, the protectors were someone to be feared. The cold ones have few natural enemies, and they survive on the lives of humans, so without the protectors, the people of the Quileute nation would have been as weak as a mouse to a hawk. For generations upon generations the protectors passed down their duties from father to firstborn son. Then one day Protector Black came across a group of individuals that looked and smelled like cold ones. However, they were unlike any creature the protectors had previously encountered. First, they were dressed like the pale-skin pioneers, including shoes, rather than being covered in rags. Second, they had eyes the color of a first morning pea. And last, they did not behave in a recognizable manner. Unlike all previous cold ones that had reacted instinctually by either fighting the protectors or running from them, they stood as if statues with the leader having his arms up, as if requesting peace. Not willing to risk the Great Spirit's ire by misusing the power given to each protector and destroying a creature that wasn't a cold one, Protector Black risked himself by returning to his human form and asking them their business. It became immediately clear that these strangers spoke the pale skin's language and did not know the mother tongue. He made it clear to the creatures that they were to remain as they were if they truly intended peace. Even more strangely, they obeyed him. Believing he had done the right thing, he returned to his wolf form, and communicated with the village that there was potential danger, requesting for his eldest daughter to be sent. With great courage and faith in the protectors his daughter made her way to the standoff. Asking Protector Black how she might be of service, he indicated his need for a translator. Promising to do her best, since she was not yet fluent in the paleface's language, she turned to the strange creatures, leader. Why do you trespass onto the land of the Quileute nation? His answer confused everyone. We were hunting in the woods and did not know we had entered your lands. Protector Black spoke with his daughter translating, what manner of creature are you that you would not recognize the borders of the lands in which we patrol? Protector Black's daughter returned the creature's words, we do not follow the dietary habits of our kind. We consume animals. Your smell intrigued us and concerned us, but we did not know to take it as a warning. We apologize for our ignorance. You are a cold one that does not hunt humans. Protector Black questioned, unsure what to do with such an answer. We believe humans to be God's creatures and thus in need of protection. I work in the town's clinic as a doctor. My wife volunteers with the charities in the town providing food and clothing for the less fortunate. My daughter helps women at risk of dying by their husband's hands with the help of her husband and my son. Protector Black considered these words. Every protector since the beginning had said that cold ones were liars, with smooth tongues, and were sneakier than any fox. Yet, this creature's words seemed truthful and his manner earnest. Stay, he commanded the group. I must ask the Great Spirit for wisdom. Take as long as you need, was the reply. Telling his daughter to return in 2 sunrises, he left the other 2 wolves guarding the group and went enough into the trees to hide his petitions from the eyes of the strange creatures. After his prayers were cast, he returned to watch the group. Previous cold ones that he had ended with his fellow protectors entered his mind, and he compared those creatures with the ones in front of him. On the second morning his daughter returned. Accompanying her in the sky was an eagle, so Protector Black told the creatures, "The Great Spirit tells me that you speak truthfully. According to your ways and laws, we shall make a treaty. You are forbidden on our lands. If one of you crosses the boundary, you all shall perish." "Agreed," the leader stated. "If one human dies, even if it is not a Quileute, on our ancestral lands from a cold one, you forfeit your lives. What if another of our kind comes without our permission and stands against us? Will you condemn us for the actions of our common enemy?" the group's leader inquired. Protector Black thought a while before asking, "How would you prove your innocence?" "If our eyes turn red, then we have consumed a human," he answered. Black nodded. "If one human dies, even if not a Quileute, on our ancestral lands and one of you have red eyes, you all forfeit your lives." "Agreed," the leader answered. After silence he said, "We would like to have an area where we can hunt without concern of encountering your kind." After much negotiations, an agreement was made. As a result, Protector Black was hailed as one of the bravest and wisest protectors for taking care to ask the Great Spirit and to not pass judgment automatically. With him, his daughter, shines brightly, is honored for her courage and knowledge that aided Protector Black. Now mine, Damien cried out. "Quiet now," Mrs. White told the boys. Mr. White smiled at his son's jubilance and winked before speaking once more. Jeremiah White was born a slave who, after the northern aggressors won the Civil War, wanted to start fresh, so walked as far west as he could go. Where he stopped walking he felt content and wished to rest. After arriving to the area, he sought out those that already lived on that land, and after learning enough of their language to petition them, got permission to build a house in the forest. The locals warned him of the animals who were accustomed to being the rulers of the forest, including bears, lions, and wolves. Over time Jeremiah made himself the tools for building a home out of materials he found and eventually built himself a one-room cabin. It wasn't much, but it was his. Then, one day a black bear decided that Jeremiah's food was meant to be his. Unfortunately, Jeremiah's front door wasn't meant to keep out a large black bear. The door buckled and the black bear came into the home. Jeremiah faced the bear and began chanting in the language of his mother. He had been sold away from her plantation too young to fully understand what the words meant. He only knew that the tune had soothed him many times as a child when he had been upset. The bear stopped his charge and looked at Jeremiah puzzled. The bear was so big that when the bear landed on his four paws he was eye to eye with Jeremiah. Jeremiah kept chanting and then began swaying side to side. Eventually, the bear began moving slightly side to side. Then, unsure if the words matched his intention, he prayed that the bear would leave peacefully. After a long time, the bear huffed as if disappointed and then left, backing out the way he had come in. When he told his friend from the Pomo Nation of the encounter, his friend gave him a Pomo name, Bear Charmer. From then on he was known as Bear Charmer. When the first white settlers came to the area, they assumed that he was Pomo, since he had learned the language, had a Pomo name, and had taken a Pomo wife. Over time, his ability to translate between English and Pomo brought him notoriety, and he was asked every so often to assist in negotiations between the settlers and the Pomo. Eventually these white settlers named the town they were creating San Francisco. When Jeremiah came to be an old man the bear returned, but kept his distance, staying to the trees. The bear warned him that the white man would cover the space with tall buildings, roads, and cull the trees. He told the elders of the Pomo Nation the bear's warnings, and spoke to his wife about it. Despite their age, they decided to travel north and persuaded all of their children except one to go with them. Eventually they found the peninsula in which our family now dwells and began building another home. The home was barely started when a black bear approached him. He chanted his mother's tongue and hoped to convey that he was fleeing from the white man and wished to live in peace. When the bear left he told his wife, "Standing tree, the bear's message. No space was safe from the white man, but here their children could flourish." So, to keep the promise of peace Jeremiah made to that bear, "We never kill bears, and are careful in the amount of fish we take home, to ensure that the bears have enough to eat also." This second story he had told like a lullaby, and by the end the two boys were asleep. There was a long silence, like neither parent wanted to disturb the peace. Eventually, rising, I wished them a whispered, good night, and headed upstairs. Laying in bed, repeating the stories in my mind, I found that the stories had made me sad, the second especially, as I remembered Charlie and how he had more fish than he could ever eat. They both reminded me of how much of our lives were out of our control. As I fell asleep, the stories swirled in my mind and my dreams turned Edward into a cold one. I opened my eyes to greet the morning, only to be accosted by the color purple. Rather than disgust and a frown, I smiled. A purple comforter covering me meant that I was at Bella's house, in Bella's bed. And that meant that I was still Bella Swan. Smiling at the fact that my prayers continued to be answered in my favor, I excitedly got up and started my morning routine. Getting ready for school was far less of a chore in this house, as there were no annoying little brothers who needed help or got in the way. Then, there was the added bonus that I could have whatever I wanted for breakfast. In fact, Chief Swan had a great collection of cereals, including ones my mother determined to be faux food and thus not worthy of her money, but man did the selection in his cupboard taste good. What did my mother know? Bella was so lucky, and I doubted she even appreciated it. She seemed more like the type that was so spoiled that she thought that she was entitled to her blessings and whined about what she didn't have. For sure, since she arrived to Forks she had been acting like everyone fawning over her was below her and that the likes of Forks students weren't worth the time of day. Forks was likely a passover for her, while the likes of Mike and me were in it for the long haul. It was one of the many reasons that made us being together obvious. One day Mike would be given his parents' shop and I'd be there every step of the way supporting him, while the likes of Bella and Mandy would be long gone. How many times had Mandy told me that Forks was too small for her and that she was leaving at the first opportunity? Girls like them would only break Mike's heart. I was saving him all that trouble. Arriving at school, I found Mike's group hanging by Jessica's car. Before I could get to Mike, Jessica intercepted me. "What were you saying to Edward in biology?" I replied, displaying my frustration. "He has refused to participate and expects me to do all the work. I was trying to convince him to do his part, so that I won't fail the class." Jessica looked shocked and whispered, "Mr. Banner always said that Edward was the smartest of the class." Her face turned calculating, like she was trying to puzzle it out. Not wanting her to get a stupid idea in her head, I mocked confided in her, "I think that he has something against me," knowing how quickly she spread information. "Is that why you asked me the first day he was back after being out sick if he looked angry at you?" She questioned, clearly excited by getting this juicy piece of information. "He has hated me since I first sat next to him, like he's too good to sit next to the likes of me," I told her. Then, giving in to my desire for pettiness, I added, lowering my voice even more, "I bet he's just upset that the seat is filled with someone who isn't you. He seems like the kind of guy who likes to play hard to get. I mean, you're clearly a good match to him. Maybe we could convince Mr. Banner to switch us." Jessica smiled widely and in appreciation, but her eyes were hesitant. "I dislike him, Jess, for real," I told her emphatically. "He's all yours. I'd be happy for you, truly." She smiled in a secret cunning way. Since I had started at Forks High, it had been obvious that Jessica was into Edward, while she repulsed him. So, the likelihood that encouraging Jessica would make Edward's life worse was an added bonus in my book. It was a win-win-win for me. It's what he gets for being such an asshole, anyway. Inside I was pleased at how my years being Mandy's friend was paying off, even if she had turned her bitchiness towards me. To Jessica I nodded my head and smiled like she would solve all my problems. This was as close as leverage against Edward the First had come across. The protectors might not be around, but he lived in the human world, and thus was subject to human rules. Whether it be enough to get him to leave my body alone and help me in biology was questionable. Walking the few more steps to Mike, I kissed his cheek. "Morning, Mike." He blinked like he was in a stupor and then smiled widely. Wrapping his arms around me, he pulled me in close and kissed my forehead in an easy, comfortable way. My smile matched his. I was so happy. Ben and Eric had stopped and stared at us for a few seconds, and then the moment was gone, and they continued on. Mike's body language said that he was proud and boastful. As I pressed myself into him, at first I hadn't known what to make of the strange hard element on my hip, but when it twitched, the light had dawned in my head. It was a part of his anatomy that my only knowledge of was due to sex ed class and changing my brother's diapers. But theirs were tiny and never compared to the pictures in sex ed. I guess learning about these things was something Mike could teach me. What I did know was that boys liked touching it. My brothers touched theirs often enough. My mother's warnings ran in my head about sex being precious between two people who loved each other. Good thing Mike and I were on our way to that point, as Leah had taught me that sex was an important step towards marriage. I was worried about getting pregnant a little. It wasn't like I was going to ask Chief Swan. I told myself not to worry. One thing sex ed had been clear on was how condoms prevented pregnancy, although could fail if not used properly. If it did fail, and I got pregnant, would that really be a bad thing? Mike's parents for sure would insist that he be responsible, marry me, and raise our child. The thought turned me off some, as it was less than romantic. I'd given up my family for us. We were meant to be. We didn't need anything like that. Yet, there was no way that I wasn't going to do everything in my power to make sure we got our happily ever after. So, although getting pregnant on purpose seemed rude, I wasn't willing to rule it out entirely, in the minuscule chance that Mike might need the push to see the truth. Still, I'd have to think it through all the way, as there could be invisible consequences, much like the swap. I was curious if Leah was accurate that Mike, like all boys, liked it being rubbed, even through clothes. Playing innocent, I moved myself in a way to rub against it, acting like my change of position was because I had been uncomfortable. The movement seemed to get to him, as he pulled me into him tighter. Proving Leah correct had never felt better. At the warning bell we separated and Mike walked me to my class. He pouted when we had to part ways and let go of each other's hands. It totally made my morning. Just when it seemed like things couldn't get better, they did. Classes were still going way over my head. It was the one part of my plan that I hadn't solved. I really couldn't afford to fail the 11th grade. Maybe I could get Mike to tutor me. Then again, did I really want Mike to know how much I didn't know? At lunch, I sat next to Mike on his right, while he talked more game stuff with the guys on his left. Most of the time I kept my hand on his thigh, running my palm up and down with my fingers brushing against his jeans. I noticed that the further up his thigh my hand went, the shallower his breathing became. I assumed that was a good thing, as he looked similar to when I kissed him. His hand had been lazily resting across the back of my chair, curled around my right shoulder in a greater degree as lunch progressed, as if he were claiming me. I was pleased as punch. In biology I had barely sat down when Edward turned to me. Truce. I was proud of myself for getting under his skin. However, I was unwilling to give an inch, so retorted under my breath, was war declared. Once more, he gave nothing away. You don't want to fail, right? He checked, in a tone like he was doing me a favor. No thanks to you, I bit back, gazing into his ever-darkening eyes. They were sinister and spoke of evil deeds, but I wasn't going to show fear. What struck me as odd was how this body didn't exhibit any fear responses in his presence. Certainly, I could remember before the body swap having at least a little sweat if any of the Cullens looked my way. Maybe there was something wrong with Bella. Like her lack of coordination, she lacked the correct responses for being in the proximity to a killer. He closed his eyes for a second or two, and it almost seemed like he was holding his breath. I'm willing to help, he replied smoothly, as if my previous tone had been politely pleasant. Oh, yeah, I checked, my eyebrow rising, absolutely willing to use everything to my advantage. You stay my lab partner, and I'll help you pass the labs, he offered. Eyeing him carefully, I rebutted, I'll stay your lab partner, you'll help me pass the labs, and give me your notes, which will include biology for dummies step-by-step guides. His eyes widened a little like he was taken back. And, I added under my breath, you stay away from Jamaica. His eyes narrowed and his head nodded just the slightest bit, like my words confirmed something for him. You don't frighten me, Mr. Cullen, I stated lowly. Others might find you intimidating, but I know that your father keeps you declawed. His eyes narrowed and his nostrils flared, but as predicted he did nothing. Eventually through gritted teeth he bit back, and if I decline? I'm sure Jessica would be thrilled, I stated, ensuring my tone suggested how much Jessica would enjoy the proximity to him. After a few more moments of evaluating me, where I refused to back down and held his gaze. He nodded in acceptance. Turning back to the front, I said nothing more, keeping my glee from showing. No one likes a boastful winner, I reminded myself. True to his word, through the period he participated as a lab partner and wasn't a complete ass to me, although his eyes remained black the entire time, so he probably was mad about it. Served him right, if you asked me. As the bell rang to end biology, for the first time, since the switch, I longed for Leah. I wanted to run into her house, pull her into her room, and tell her how I got a Cullen to do my bidding. She would stare at me in awe and think I was badass. Paying less attention in gym than was probably safe, I tried to figure out how to get into contact with her without Sue or Billy or Jacob figuring out what we had done. She and I were stupid to not set up some way to stay in touch after the swap. There had been so many details we hadn't considered, since we were basically certain it wouldn't work. After school I had followed Mike to his parents' store and we had chatted between the few customers he had before his mother showed up and kicked me out in a huff. I then drove to Port Angeles and bought a new bra and underwear for our date. Once more the staff were helpful, even suggesting colors that would complement my skin tone or designs that would give me more cleavage. It was almost like being a princess. It was a night and day difference in comparison to the hostile stares and ugly energy that had been my norm in stores before the swap. For a brief moment my mother's words about what it meant to be seen in society as a black woman flew through my mind. Refusing to consider that my mother might have been right, I decided that the difference in treatment was because of me having money to spend, which was almost never the case previously. Driving back to Forks, I basked in how drastically my life had improved in ways more than dating Mike. I had money to spend, time alone, little supervision, a car, and help in stores. Ma's voice lingered in the back of my mind, telling me stories of driving while black, discrimination in job promotions, and other things to expect as a black woman. Maybe she had experienced some of those things, but it was the 21st century. Those problems were in the past. For each time I told myself these two statements, a flash of how differently I had been treated since the swap passed through my mind. I refused to agree with my mom. Those people, like Mrs. Cope, were the exceptions. People weren't treated differently because of the color of their skin. How many times had Mandy told me that? As soon as my mind began to ponder the possibility of Ma's words, I rejected the thought. No way in hell was there even the tiniest possibility that Mike treated me differently because of my appearance. Soulmates knew each other. It was just about acknowledging what was truth. Despite my mental certainty, doubt lingered, causing me to be increasingly angry at my mother. It was her fault for placing such doubt of others inside of me. I wasn't going to be like her, no way. Even though it was after dinner time when I arrived back at Chief Swan's house, he wasn't there. Rummaging through the kitchen, I found some snacks and took them to my room, starting on my homework. Not only did I want to pass, but also it was a good distraction from my previous inner debate. Spanish was the easiest, so got that out of the way first. Next was English, as it was reading, and a little of writing, which although contained some things I didn't know, wasn't terrible. The same was true of government. Math and biology were horrible. If I couldn't figure them out, they were going to give me away. A little after 8 Chief Swan brought home pizza. Thanking him, as I had begun to worry about food for the night, I ate a slice in the kitchen and then using homework as an excuse, asked if I could eat the rest in my room. He agreed easily and then went and watched some sports. As he walked away I felt a twinge of sadness, remembering how Friday was storytelling night and the stories my father might be sharing. He was the best storyteller, even better than Elder Black. Wiping a lone tear that had made its way out of my eye, I chastised myself for my sentimentality. There was no story he would tell that I hadn't heard before. As much as I missed him, he too hadn't understood what I had been going through, reminding me of my obligations and heritage, supporting my mother's ridiculous ideas about being on guard for being treated badly due to my skin tone. They hadn't got me at all and had acted like Mandy's actions were something I should just get over. Ignoring their advice and doing the swap had been way better. I had found a way to get back at Mandy, get the man of my dreams, and have it all. With that thought, my mind conjured images of Mike and I in the house while Chief Swan was absent. These swimming pictures became more detailed with greater attention. They delighted me, but I forced myself to focus on the task at hand, trying to not fail my classes. Nevertheless, tomorrow couldn't come early enough. While us Cullens stood outside school preparing ourselves for the day ahead and talking about how we each were going to enact Carlisle's instructions, Jessica's thoughts bombarded me, as if she was screaming my name an inch away. Tuning into her mind without moving my body in her direction, I discovered that the person in Bella's body was telling Jessica that she'd get Mr. Banner to switch the seats, so Jessica could attempt to get into my pants. The games of teenage girls were very familiar to me. By this stage of my existence nothing they did was new. It was like they were playing checkers and I had already memorized all the moves. Didn't make their behavior any more irritating or repulsive, though. During the school day, I kept mental tabs on Bella's body through other juniors and what we believed to be Bella's thoughts in Jamerica's body. Simultaneously, Alice and I were using our gifts to try and gain the confidence of the person residing in Bella's body. Shockingly, we were unable to find an option that would work. Oddly enough, she shunned Alice, irrelevant of how Alice approached her. To test out if Bella's body's lack of a fear response was only directed to me and thus influencing the outcomes, Alice not so accidentally bumped into her. Instead of a fear response, Alice reported the behaviors of indifference. It made the situation even stranger. Certainly, Carlisle's hypothesis that the fear response humans had towards us was automatic and biologically tied seemed confirmed. He would be pleased at the evidence, but it was unhelpful in actually solving the problem of befriending the person residing in Bella's body. No biological elucidations could explain why the person masquerading as Bella, essentially, during biology class declared her knowledge of us as vampires. Even no fear response to us biologically wouldn't remove prudence or caution. Instead, she seemed confident that we were incapable of hurting her. Her language implied that Carlisle had some way of controlling us. The whole thing was unnerving, but it did help explain somewhat her attitude towards me. In contradiction to her words, her whole approach actually just fueled my desire to experience the total momentary bliss her blood offered to me and thus end her life. Her ability to get under my skin in a manner that increased the temptation she held was significant. This, coupled with my personal indignation of how she treated me, seemingly pushed me closer to the proverbial edge of tasting her. The small part of me that had returned from Denali refusing to allow an insignificant human girl to drive me away from my family fueled me to find an antidote. I clung tightly to its refusal to be undone and shame Carlisle, let alone violate the treaty, due to some arrogant little witch with just enough knowledge about the Quileute mythology to make her dangerous. I reminded myself that she was merely playing checkers, a child's game. The only thing remotely interesting about the person sitting next to me in biology was how she had based her fearlessness of me on her knowledge of our treaty with the Quileutes. Her comment about Carlisle keeping me declawed was particularly low, and worse, she knew it. She seemed willing to do nearly anything to get her way, including baiting a cold one. It was juvenile and petty, and thus heavily irritating, as it was exactly the kind of high school behavior that I couldn't stand and was so common, especially with females. The greatest problem with her approach from my moral view was that it was conniving, manipulative, and unethical in its self-serving motives. So, although it impressed me in how her mind worked and the cleverness of how she worked to get her way, it also repulsed me, and had me wondering if the world would be better off without her. In that way, Mike and her were a great match. It certainly didn't do her any favors in terms of me convincing the demon inside of me to let her live. At least the Bella I had first met had the decency to give me the benefit of the doubt and be slightly concerned about my behaviors. She had seemingly been concerned for me, which was ridiculous but respectable. She had been too curious and observant for her own good. Contrarily, her sweet temperament and presentation of weakness made her an easy kill in many ways, and thus a slight turn-off. This pretend Bella's flagrant dismissal of me as any threat in the least was like waving a red flag at a bull. It has set my venom on fire and encouraged my demon. Thus, in biology class, I spent most of my mental energy trying to resist the demon inside me that said the taste of her blood would be worth any cost, foremost using my stubborn refusal to succumb. In that internal fight for control, I realized that her behaving like the rest of the adolescent herd was fueling my coveting. For my own conscience and for her ability to keep her life, I used a trick Carlisle taught me in my early years. I worked to see how she was unique and worthy of living till old age. My anger at how she had encouraged Jessica made that difficult. All day Jessica's thoughts had been forcefully loud and she had cried out my name mentally so many times, that I had struggled to do all the jobs via my gift that I had committed to do. Not to mention the content of her thoughts had been revolting. She was exactly the worst kind of woman my human mother had warned me about. If the fake Bella had been playing checkers, I had been playing chess. Taking her challenge of me as an opportunity to gain the information we needed to hopefully resolve Alice's gift, she had played into my hands. She had admitted, albeit indirectly, that she cared about Jamerica, who for all intents and purposes the real Bella Swan couldn't have possibly known. Thus, she outed herself as being Jamerica within Bella's body. My strategy of acting as if she had the winning hand was already giving me an advantage. These types of girls were all the same. They wanted to stay on top of the social ladder. Hopefully, her believing that she had bested me would feed her ego enough to be careless with her words around me. Her being mentally mute to my gift was irrelevant. I was far more skilled in playing mental games than her. She didn't stand a chance. Alice must have been watching closely, because between classes she told me, "Smart move. Your future cleared up a bit." Entering my next class, Alice's thoughts were directed at me, "You can do it. You know how much Rosalie would hold it against you if we had to move." Glad to have her support on both fronts, the next step was convincing myself to keep the demon within me caged. By the end of the last class one had come up with a very short list of 2 reasons to not consume all of the blood in Bella's body. 1. Chief Swan would be devastated, and 2. Assuming we were correct that there had been a swap, Bella would never get her body back. It was actually the second which was my greatest motivator, because I had become impressed with the thoughts and thus soul which resided in Jamerica's body. Her disgust at her body's behaviors, especially in relation to Mike, were similar to my own, and I found it warming that we shared being virgins in common, as it was a rare trait in girls of this era. More than anything, I was impressed at how, despite the situation the person in Jamerica's body was thrust into, which seemed to be outside of her control, she had no antagonistic thoughts towards the person residing in her body. Overall, she was clever, thoughtful, and kind. The thoughts from Jamerica's body, oddly enough for her age and era, seemed to have no value towards outward appearances. Her thoughts never compared herself to others or others to each other, except in how they treated another person, and even then she always assumed the best of everyone, even Mandy, who in my opinion didn't deserve her kindness. I would even go so far to say that she was kind to a fault, much like Carlisle and Esme. Furthermore, she was genuine, never lying to someone, yet thoughtful of others' feelings, so often managing the truth in a gentle way. While having these similarities to my parents, she also had courage and grit in measures that were equally rare in a modern female. Overall, I found myself admiring her, and thus drawn to get to know her better. Although I found myself believing her soul lovelier the longer I listened to her thoughts, I hoped Alice or Jasper hadn't copped onto my attraction. The family had already agreed that friendship was a terrible idea. Hopefully, I could keep my interest in her from them and simply admire her from afar. I found myself needing to hide in a smile when Rosa spoke to her, offering her friendship. Rosa was also a kind person with caring thoughts, although compared herself and others far more. She was nearly as thoughtful of others and gentle in her thoughts as Angela. When I compared the 3 ladies, I found myself more attracted to the thoughts in Jamerica's body. Perhaps, I theorized, my reaction was because I was observing someone reacting to an adverse condition. She certainly was behaving with grace and courage under fire, and it reminded me of some of the women's thoughts from when I was first turned. Assuming that I could learn more about the person in Jamerica's body outside of school, since she kept her thoughts on schoolwork throughout the day, only deviating occasionally during class or when she was between class or at lunch, during the last period I decided to follow her home. "Yes, continue to keep tabs," Alice stated with a tone that indicated that she doubted some part of my decision, while simultaneously encouraging me. "I'll tell the rest," Alice proclaimed with glee. Her assurance was appreciated, yet her tone gave me pause. Clearly she had an agenda. I couldn't discern what it was, since the visions that flashed through her mind didn't give any insight into what I would learn, only that I wasn't found out. In the hall I passed by Jasper and gave him my keys. Secretly following Jamerica's body by staying within the tree line in the upper branches, I was surprised to learn that she walked home. For reasons that puzzled me, That truth caused me to become uncomfortable, as if it provoked anxiety within me. Nothing in all my years since my transformation had contained the smallest amount of fear when it came to humans. They were a weak prey species that could never hurt me. The last time I could remember experiencing this feeling was when Maria had visited and had made a mess we were forced to clean up. Nothing about Jamaica's body walking home alone compared to that experience. I was completely stumped. Almost involuntarily, my mind began to think of ways that I could remedy her situation, but nothing came to mind. The longer my mind did not generate a solution, the worse the feeling became. It was befuddling to say the least. She spent most of her walk home evaluating her present strange situation of living within someone else's body. She exerted her mental focus trying to figure out a way to navigate it without getting into trouble with the human authorities. Not only was this absolute confirmation, but how she thought about it was helpful for my sake. From my observations, despite what had happened, and how she could have, rightfully so, thrown a big fit, she was instead accepting of these changes to her and had been trying to make the best of it. Her struggles with lying and her dislike of deceiving people increased my appreciation of her. Furthermore, her mind was very methodical, which combined with her gentle spirit caused me to compare it to Carlyle's. I also got as close as I could at this point in confirmation that Bella was within Jamaica's body. She referred to herself as Bella and the room she placed her belongings as Jamaica's. Relieved and glad, I was also perplexed at how she seemed to be intuitively aware of my presence. Without a doubt she couldn't see me. In fact, her thoughts confirmed that was the case. Nevertheless, she had noted my presence, and had determined me to be an angel. Her conclusion caused me to doubt everything previous about her, as me being an angel was preposterous. Despite her conclusion of my nature, the longer I stayed with her the more upset she became. Her thoughts indicated that it wasn't my presence so much as she had reached her limit of strange. Consequently, she hadn't been home very long when she mentally asked me to leave, even though she thought herself mentally unstable for doing so. Being a gentleman and honoring the lady's request, along with not wanting to increase her distress, I left. Struggling with everything I had seen, heard, and learned, along with my own reactions when Carlyle arrived home, I asked him to hunt with me. He greeted Esme and then we headed out. We ran for a bit, my thoughts tumbling over themselves. Eventually I put them into a semblance of an order and told him she could sense me following her home today and came to the conclusion that I was an angel. An angel, Carlyle. I would ask what is faulty with her, except that her logic was sound. I simply cannot agree. What was her decision-making process? He wondered, his mental tone both worried and slightly comforted by my distress, which seemed rude. She could sense me, but not see or hear me, so began to create a list of possible explanations. Her list was quite long and mythical. I told him, chuckling at how she hadn't ruled anything out from the beginning. It was a refreshing mental state. Then, she determined that she felt no ill will from me, and so took out every creature from her list that was focused on harming humans. She then evaluated the nature of the creature, its capacity to remain unheard and unseen, while humans had still reported sensing their presence. Her conclusion was angel, very methodical, open-minded, and yet logical, despite the circumstance, he concluded, seemingly by his mental tone impressed with her. Her trusting in her instincts is impressive for someone of this generation, he added as an introspective afterthought. Those were my thoughts. I teased him with a smile in an attempt to lighten the mood before I frowned once more in distress. He chuckled. Then, in a joking tone asked, "So, what's the problem?" "You know that the idea of being compared to an angel is detestable to me," I stated, disgruntled, and then ranting a little added, "How many times did the victim think something similar while running to safety right before I murdered the human who had been hurting them?" His tone, gentle and loving, told me the same thing he had multiple times before. Even if you took a human's life and quenched your thirst does not diminish the victim's gratitude for how you helped them. Your selfish motives for aiding them doesn't alter their appreciation. In many ways they could have used the term knight in shining armor and meant the same thing. But I suspect that whom you followed today did not mean the word in the way of your past. Frowning, disliking the point he was making, I nevertheless agreed, no, she didn't. She was trying to find a logical conclusion to the evidence presented to her. Although angel isn't close to vampire, for sure, she was correct in a way, wasn't she? Yes, I replied. None of her thinking was faulty. I meant her no harm, and was simply curious. Imagine that kind of intuitive sense, thinking capacity, and open-mindedness in a body where your mind reading would not have worked, he mused and then imagined how quickly I would have let something slip. You rely on your gift too much. Rolling my eyes, I muttered, yes, I know. You've only told me that once or twice since my awakening. Chuckling he replied, well, clearly it has needed repeating. We scented some caribou, so ran in their direction. After we each took one, we settled on the ground, as we had come near to a cliff of sorts and the view was enjoyable. How are you doing? He asked, his tone coated in compassion, and then added, truthfully. She had undone much of my belief systems and thus opinions about this life without meaning to, I answered. His thoughts were on the beauty of the nature surrounding us, clearly allowing me to continue. These events have invalidated much of my beliefs when it comes to souls. The current evidence due to these events indicates that souls and bodies are not the same thing, which has destroyed most of my arguments regarding why vampires have no souls. However, we are creatures that survive off of blood and our existence requires breaking most of the 10 Commandments, so I'm still not convinced that we aren't damned. Nevertheless, I can reluctantly admit to there being a sliver of possibility that your belief about souls has merit. We have souls and our damnation is based on our efforts, just like it is for humans, he repeated as if in a mental reflex before once more turning his thoughts back to the view. Ignoring his brief inconsequential thought, I continued, my craving for blood, especially as a newborn, and more recently towards Bella's body I certainly perceive as a demon trying to overtake me. It was an old comment that had passed between us many times. Human newborns are nothing but instincts. Although ours calls for blood, and humans the most, I cannot believe that this alone determines our fate. Human children bite, hit, and otherwise harm their parents and others. The scripture teaches us that the world is fallen and we are all with sin. But living in a sinful world and resisting the urges that calls us to harm others does not make us demons, he told me, as he had many times before. However, this time instead of rejecting his thoughts outright as ridiculous, I deeply contemplated them. With a tenuous tone, I offered, even if vampires, in general, do have souls, then would not my years of hunting humans damn mine? The scripture says that we stand account after we leave this earth. How are you to know how you will be judged? Perhaps your years of not doing so stands in contrast. Is it not God's place to be judge rather than yours? You would make your father proud, I grumbled. Edward, he stated in such a soft tender way that reminded me of my human mother, you hold yourself to such high expectations. This is not a bad thing, per se, except that all of us have fallen short. Instead of condemning yourself, let us think about how you might be of service. Turning my head, I stared at him in an accusatorial manner. He said nothing, simply waiting. Eventually I muttered, I don't know how. Well, assuming that a spell was cast without Isabella's permission, how is she coping? Relatively well, actually, I told him, and then went on to explain how she was handling everything with grace and her dislike of deception. He was putting together information in a way that told me he was working something out. His process was always more intuitive than logical, so often lacking the mental crumbs I would have preferred. It was easy to imagine his mind working similarly to Bella's when he had been human. The sun had already set and the moon was hidden behind the clouds when he asked, "Are you attracted to Bella?" His question fit a pattern he was examining, but I couldn't understand the value of the question. "She is my singer," I answered, unsure of what else to say. "And her soul." Pondering that, I told him, "I'm not sure attracted is the right word, but I do enjoy listening to her and learning more about her." Completely changing his thought direction, he asked, "Have you considered desensualization?" "I do at school," I informed him. "I assumed you would. How about out of school?" "No, I have not," I replied. "Perhaps you and Alice can find a way to have her scent with you the other hours." I cannot say about Bella's body's scent in particular, but desensualization has worked otherwise, so it stands to reason that it would in this case also. "Yes, I will speak to Alice," I promised, even though the burn of her scent being with me on a regular basis sounded like a terrible plan. "I am proud of you for changing your mind. You changing is a good thing. It is a blessing to watch." Looking at him in confusion, as he had clearly made some connection I had missed, I hoped he would explain himself, but he didn't. We stayed together for a few more hours, before his missing of Esme caused him to want to return home. As we got closer to Forks, I went in the direction of the Swan house, while he sought out Esme. I made a purposeful decision, as a kind of request, for Alice to join me. About an hour later Alice showed up reeking of Jasper. Blessedly she was keeping her thoughts of him under wraps. Any ideas? I asked her. She chose different items of clothing. Unfortunately, what generated the strongest reaction for me, and thus would probably be the most helpful, were her knickers. I groaned in resignation, while Alice smirked and went in and found the freshest pair. I had moved myself to be deep in the forest, as a precaution. When she handed them to me I was solely able to stop myself from running towards her, but the fabric was in pieces. Fortunately, Alice had already seen this outcome and handed me a second pair. Preparing myself for having a similar reaction allowed me to have a less animalistic response. Embarrassingly, though, my pants had tented. Alice eyed me carefully and with reluctance to broach the subject asked, "Are you physically attracted to her?" Freezing completely, my mind immediately began evaluating my reactions. Certainly on my first day the only awareness I had was of her blood and my frustration at not being able to read her thoughts. But this past Monday when I had returned, I had found her charming and attractive, if off-putting. "Maybe," I choked out. "It's nothing to be ashamed of, Edward," she told me. Rosalie was attracted to human Emmett and Carlyle to Esme. Was this the conclusion Carlyle had come to? Was it possible that I was changing not just from evidence presented to me, but because I had found my mate in Bella? That certainly would explain why the body swap messed with my visions related to you, Alice mused, already catching on to where my thoughts had gone. Her tone suggested that she had already come to this conclusion and was simply pleased that I was ready to hear it. I groaned. Presumable Jamaica masquerading as Bella would continue to live, as even if there was only some chance of Alice's conclusion being true, I couldn't murder the body of my unlikely mate, even if the scent promised me the sweetest, most delectable meal in my existence. Against my wishes, my mind conjured my teeth pressing past the barrier of her skin and being filled with the flavor she would offer. Then, it morphed into us having sex while I consumed her. Trying to stop my own mind from the images of torture it was generating, I found myself morphing the image into us being husband and wife and making love together, as if we were both human. "Ah!" I grunted out. "You are," she exclaimed. Suddenly her mind was filled with images of weddings and all kind of things that were impossible. "Don't forget that Bella no longer resides in her body," I nearly growled suddenly, frustrated with the situation, my own reaction, my loss of control over my body, and Alice's exuberance. Immediately Alice stopped and frowned. "Can they even be switched back?" she asked as if I held the answer, which was ridiculous. "I don't know, Alice," I replied, exasperated, frustrated at her behavior towards me and desires about me. "The clothes helping?" she wondered, her mind completely changing direction suddenly. Checking myself, I nodded in the affirmative, as it had helped with the bloodlust, even if my carnal lust had increased. "Let's go back," she instructed. Oddly, I didn't want to go. Irritated at my odd feelings and reactions, I turned and started running. As we traveled back home, she began figuring out how to get the garments every day, bring them to me, and replace them without Bella, well, probably Jamaica, who was resided in her body, being aware. At least the person in Bella's body won't be as curious or confused if the garments don't match exactly, she mused and then began thinking about more risque options. "Please, no," I begged her. She just giggled like I was being silly. I awoke on my own accord, no one coming and banging on the door or yelling through it. This pleasant surprise led me to assume that Saturdays were a day when Jamaica could have slept in as much as she wanted. Given the prayers for food, I was guessing that church was in order for tomorrow. Groaning at the downsides of this family's rhythm, especially regarding going to church, as having a religion seemed illogical to me, I got up, took care of my morning needs, got dressed, and then headed to the kitchen for breakfast. When I arrived everyone else was talking animatedly still in their nightclothes. I had probably enacted another faux pas, but it was too late to undo it. "You have any homework left?" Mrs. White asked me as soon as her eyes had caught my form in the kitchen doorway. "Quileute and English," I told her. "Bring your quileute with you," she instructed me, as she placed a bowl on the table, which I assumed was for me. When I sat down, she added, I'm sure Leah could help you. Sure, I agreed after taking a mouthful of her amazing oatmeal, grateful that she had given me the avenue to solve the problem that had been tying me in knots. That problem resolved, the next was to figure out how to either fool Leah or discover a way to keep her silent. Mrs. White eyed me critically, but said nothing. It was annoying that she could read me so well, but then I thought about Charlie, who barely had spent any time with me, and Renee, who was too scatterbrained to know me like Mrs. White knew her daughter. I could easily imagine Mrs. White's attentiveness annoying anyone else, and especially her daughter, but given my parents, I appreciated it and found myself envying Jamerica a little. While eating, I allowed the conversation flowing between Jamerica's parents and brothers to infiltrate me. This type of family exchange contained all of the elements that I had longed to have when I was a child living with Renee. By the time I had turned 12, I knew that if Renee gave me siblings, the responsibility of them would have fallen upon me, since she was so carefree and absent-minded. I already had enough on my plate in taking care of her, so stopped my wishing. Nevertheless, my awareness hadn't smothered my yearnings for a family similar to this one, except I had yearned for older brothers, even though I knew it wasn't possible. Simultaneously, sitting in this space observing these moments allowed me to know that my imaginings had only been useful as a fantasy. How many other moments had there been this week of stress and chores? Would I really envy Jamerica if I had a lifetime of the downsides? Holding my feelings in, since neither Mr. nor Mrs. White had responded well to my tears, I tried to absorb the vibrancy of the scene into me, relishing in the magic of being able to have something that otherwise would have remained a dream. It would be one of my most cherished memories for sure. When the boys were done, they rushed upstairs, presumably to change. I stood, taking my bowl to the sink, and started doing dishes. Mrs. White looked at me, her face softening. Appreciate it. When I'm ready, we'll go. Pops has to go in for a few hours today, but will then meet up with us. You're welcome, I told her in response, suspecting in how she spoke to me that she had decided I was not Jamerica. Examining me closely once more, she moved her head like what I had said confirmed her suspicions, and then she moved to go upstairs. My stomach filled with violent moths and my chest felt like an elephant was stepping on me. My breathing became shallower and my vision filled with black spots. Holding on to the side of the sink, I took deep breaths. This sensation was like when I would find out that Renee hadn't paid a critical bill, only worse. I knew from past experience this was fear. I learned over time to stay calm in order to come up with a plan. Only this time there was no plan. Everything was out of my hands. I couldn't fix it. After taking more deep breaths and forcing myself to be logical, I came to the conclusion that Mrs. White's lack of confrontation about my identity meant that she was playing it cool. I had known keeping myself hidden had to end at some point. I expected myself to be joyous at the revelation, since returning to my skin would be the natural progression. Instead, I found myself sad with a touch of wistfulness. My thought repeated that nothing wondrous and joyous in my life had lasted. Even my best friendship with Renee had come to an end once she became serious about Phil. These statements equally surprised me. It was as if the moment that it could be taken away had illuminated the truth that I had buried from myself. I wasn't sure what to think about my heart's desire to let Jamerica keep my body. It seemed like I was betraying myself in some fundamental way, which then resulted in guilt and shame. These were foreign feelings. I didn't know what to do with them. Instead of dwelling on them and overthinking, like I usually did, I decided to ignore them and attempt to pretend that they didn't exist. Forcing my thoughts away from where it was looping, I compelled myself to focus on the task at hand, reminding myself that I could deal with whatever crisis came when it arrived. Initially, forcing myself to complete the chore in front on me, I ended up scrubbing the kitchen mercilessly. When there was no more to be done, I went to my room to pack up my books and materials for being tutored in Quileute. By the time I came back downstairs, the boys were putting on their shoes, so I did also. We played silly games until Mrs. White joined us. While she locked up, we piled into the car. Once the boys were settled and ready, we headed out. The drive was the first time I had been back on the reservation since I had last visited Charlie in Forks, which would have made me about 11 or 12. The roads and the trees that lined them had a vague sense of being familiar until we started down the small streets that contained houses. When Mrs. White stopped the vehicle, she had pulled up in front of the house that I assumed to be where Leah and her family lived. Even though nothing specifically came to mind, the surroundings had an odd sense of comfort. I gave myself a few seconds to examine the house closely. It was a one-floor bungalow with nice windows painted a dark brown. In the front yard someone had made space for gardening and flowers. There were a few places where the siding had seen better days. Yet, what stood out the most was its homey, welcoming appearance. Giving up trying to place the feelings it generated within me, I got out of the car and went to aid Damien, who was strapped in behind me. Before I had finished helping him get unbuckled, an older woman, presumably Leah's mom, had opened the door and greeted us. Certain I would give myself away to her, I focused on helping Damien and said nothing but a greeting. When we got near the front door, a girl about my age opened it, smiled widely at me, grabbed my wrist, and pulled me deeper into the house. She stopped moving when we entered what was clearly her room. "Close the door behind you," she instructed. Doing what she said, I then turned and looked around completely at a loss. A few seconds passed, then, she came up to me and whispered softly, "Bella." My eyes grew large and I stepped back, accidentally running my back into the door. Her face split open into a huge smile and she exclaimed, while keeping her volume low, "It worked." Then, she put out her hand telling me, "I'm Leah." Appreciating the clarification and introduction, I shook it awkwardly, looking at her in puzzlement, a million questions running through my mind. "You know," I angrily whispered, all my hurt, confusion, and frustration from the past week coming out. She frowned and eyed me with slight apprehension and concern, while she asked me, "You mad?" Unwilling to share too much with her, I instead said, "It's been a huge shock, really hard, and damn scary." "Yeah," she muttered, sounding sympathetic. Frowning as if in thought, she took some steps backward, while also eyeing me critically, moving away from me and towards the corner of the room where her twin-sized bed was located. Her movement allowed me to take a step into the room. When she was next to the bed, she positioned herself in order to sit on top of the covers with her back against the wall and her legs stretched out in front of her. Her legs were so long that, even though she was sitting widthwise, half of her calves were hanging off the mattress. It seemed like she wasn't going to say anything, which irritated me. Dejected and conflicted, I questioned, "Do you know when we switch back?" A part of me wanted to take some of the negative emotions I had experienced since the swap out on her, but then wonderful, beautiful memories from the last couple of days came to mind. Confused at my feelings of frustration, irritation, and annoyance combined with gratitude and satisfaction, not to mention the guilt and shame I was trying to keep locked up, a scowl adorned my features, while I worked at keeping words that could have been said behind my lips. Leah looked at me like she was trying to size me up and then challenge me, "So sick of being a qualoot already? How did you expect me to fool everyone with no warning?" I retorted, unwilling to even start in finding an answer to her snarkiness. My question seemed to push her into becoming less defensive, as she stopped, and her features transformed from angry to frowning. After pondering for a few minutes, her frown intensified before she admitted very softly, "We honestly didn't think it would work, and we're more messing around than anything." Then, suddenly her face brightened, "But I can teach you to act more like Jamaica." She stopped abruptly, and then questioned me, her tone harsh once more, "You going to rat us out?" This girl was going to give me emotional whiplash. It's like she didn't know what feeling to feel, or worse, took no time to consider her words before they left her mouth. My confusion and irritation at her wasn't helping, so I set them temporarily aside. Really mulling over what she was asking, it took me a few minutes, but then I replied, "Number." She looked at me cautiously and speculatively, as if she wasn't sure to believe me. Clearly, she hadn't thought through the consequences to me for telling anyone that the body in which I currently resided wasn't the one I was born into. Before she could say something, I warned her, "Eventually someone is going to figure it out." Her features changed once more, softening, and added a contemplative element. Coming back to her original question, I added earnestly, hoping she would believe me, "But until then or the switch back, whichever comes first, I'll play along with some conditions." "What conditions?" Leah asked hesitantly. "You get Jamaica to pass my classes and you teaching me Quileute," I stated, proud of myself for sounding firm. Leah seemed genuinely relieved at my answer. Sure. Those are given." Then after a brief scrutiny, questioned, anything else? Why is she all into Mike? I pressed, as it was the one thing apart from how it actually happened that was a complete mystery to me. She explained how Jamerica had been interested in Mike for years, but he hadn't given her the time of day recently, and how she thought this would be the best way to show him that they were meant to be together. The way she talked about it made it seem like it was a one-way trip, but in all the movies and novels, usually the protagonists learn some lesson and the bodies are switched back. The idea that this could be my reality for the rest of my life hit me in the gut. My epiphany must have been transparent, as Leah stopped her rambling and looked at me concerned. Eventually, I found my voice, and with great trepidation asked, "How do we switch back?" She looked embarrassed and worried, placing her eyes on every surface of the room except me, and then reluctantly admitted, "According to the myth there is no back." The blood rushed out of my face and I became nauseated. Then, before I could even squeak, she added, "We planned Jamerica trying it first, since she doesn't live on the res, and the elders here would figure out quicker than townies. Now that we know it works, we're going to try me switching with Emily." The room started spinning. "Water," I squeaked out, trying to maintain my equilibrium. "Be right back," she told me, her tone sounding worried. Sure, I had begun to find parts of Jamerica's life to be appreciative of, and that had made the situation more bearable. Plus I had briefly entertained the possibility that the switch could be permanent. However, and it was a big however, the way she said it so matter-of-factly made her words seem like a wrecking ball that obliterated any hope I harbored. My mind began spinning with the consequences. Tears started rolling down my face and my breathing became more and more erratic. When Leah walked in the door she took one look at me, thrust the glass of water at me, and informed me, "Be right back." Taking a few deep breaths, I drank some water, and tried to get a handle on myself. She returned once more and handed me some toilet paper, looking at me as if I were a skittish animal about to bolt. "Thanks," I mumbled between sips of water and blowing my nose. Forcing my mind to be logical, a few facts emerged. 1. She wasn't certain why the spell worked, which meant there were potentially lots of options she wasn't aware of. 2. Given 1, her tone of certainty was misplaced, as there might be a way to get back to my body. 3. After messing up my life, she wanted to repeat this spell with someone named Emily. The fact this was all over a boy stuck with me, like gum you had accidentally sat on. There was too much to try and sort out my thoughts about that detail, so was something to consider later. My list helped calm my fear. As my breathing became more regular and the tears stopped, my brain kept looping on her stated desire to do the spell again. As the words settled more into me, my face contorted into a strange mixture of surprise and disgust. Then, the idea came to me that it was the perfect opening to allow me to learn more. Maybe I could find a way to switch us back. "What would you need to do it again?" She seemed taken aback by my question. After a few minutes she answered, "You have a point. For it to work we might need you and Jamerica." Her answer had completely nothing to do with my question. She seemed to have a one-track mind and a hearing problem. Unwilling to get into all that, I instead inquired, "Why Emily?" Leah frowned. "My fiancé broke up with me and fell in love with her." Eyeing her critically, especially after the lessons I had learned this past week, I asked her, "Why would you want to lose everything that makes you for a guy?" "He's worth it," she stated vehemently. Unwilling to argue with her, as she came across as a stubborn mule, I instead imagined the impact body switching would have to this Emily, if she were anything like me. It seemed cruel on their part. Her description made it seem like the switch between Jamerica and me had been almost accidental. To know it worked and then do it again purposefully, forcing someone to give up her whole identity seemed vicious. Guessing that getting angry at Leah wouldn't help the situation any, and I really needed her to help me navigate being in Jamerica's skin, I attempted as much as possible to put myself in Leah's shoes. She clearly loved this guy, and they had been engaged at one point, which seemed like a big deal, even if I wasn't interested in marriage. She probably saw the switch as a way to get her man back, and in a small way I could maybe see that, but mentally I couldn't get past the cost to Emily. Leah kept staring at me, as if she could tell I was thinking about what she said. And then, without prompting, she started telling me about her relationship with Sam, how he had disappeared, returned, been distant, and then dumped her for her cousin. Honestly, He didn't seem like a guy worth all the trouble to me, but obviously Leah thought he was godlike. While she told me her life story, no doubt as a way to try and win me over, I tried to calculate the cost I would pay in attempting to stop her and Jamaica doing the switch with Emily. First, I really couldn't afford to have Leah as an enemy, and she clearly wanted Sam above all else. Second, if she was correct that this was permanent, then I needed allies, especially in her and Jamaica. It was like they had me cornered and there was little I could do about it. And learning the ritual seemed like the best way to learn about how to maybe undo it. My realization in how much they had messed with my life without considering the consequences to me resulting in my anger rising at them to a level that I ever had been before. Even as I thought about it more, endeavoring to calm my ire, my mind refused to accept their plan. No one should have to endure what I had been through over the last week. So many things could do wrong and already had. Yet, if I wanted my body back, what other option did I have? Okay, I'm in, I told Leah with a sigh. However, before her grin could spread any wider I added my conditions, which I doubted they would meet in order to buy myself time to find a way to reverse the swap. First, we have to successfully convince everyone that I am Jamaica, including me learning Quileute. Second, Emily has to agree to the swap. It was terrible waking up in a strange space in a foreign body, and I won't be a part of some else going through that. Being a white for a week had become nice, but I didn't plan on living Jamaica's life for the rest of mine. Deal, Leah agreed before my words were even finished. Then, as if getting to business, she asked, "Who are you not fooling?" "Mrs. White for sure," I replied easily. "Everyone else has chalked my odd behaviors up to the death of Jamaica's grandmother. Which means my mother would be even harder to fool," Leah mused. "Probably," I agreed, going along, since my childhood memories from my time with Charlie didn't include her mother. "Let's start with names." "No, Quileute," Leah rebutted. "I'll write out names and family connections later." Shrugging and unwilling to argue, I pulled out my books. Leah was an even better teacher than Mrs. White. She used regular things as we were doing them to construct sentences and demonstrate the language. It was odd, because there were pieces of it that came to me intuitively, like some part of my body remembered the sounds and pronunciation. When her mom called us out for lunch, Leah asked if we could eat in her room. Her mother agreed, so we kept at it. Leah was all business and determined. It seemed like she was willing to go to any length to have a chance to win Sam back. When Mrs. White told me it was time to go, Leah promised to call Jamaica. Evidently, Leah's plan was for Jamaica to teach me how to fool her parents. Talking to Jamaica in my body sounded like a terrible idea, but I had to agree with Leah's logic. "You and Leah have a good time together?" Mrs. White asked on the drive home. Once more I was in the passenger seat and the boys were in the back, except it took less than 5 miles before the boys were knocked out, a clear indication that they had a good time. Mr. White was driving his cruiser, traveling behind us. "Yeah," I answered with a smile. Despite the circumstance, I had enjoyed Leah's company. She humphed like that confirmed something for her. It reminded me of her and Mr. White's whispered conversation that if something had happened Leah was in on it. She was right about it all, and I had to give her credit. Continuing to fool her seemed mean. I began to rethink Leah's plan. We got back in time for her to serve dinner, but there were no stories. Maybe that was a Friday night only thing. Mrs. White asked for me to help the boys in the bath, while she and Mr. White cleaned the kitchen. Getting the boys through their routine was a messy job, but fun. After the boys were washed, dressed for bed, and tucked in, I went to my room and started on English. Both Mr. and Mrs. White had come up and kissed the boys goodnight, but Mrs. White, instead of heading towards her room like Mr. White had, came to mine. She didn't knock. Rather, she pushed the door open, since it had been cracked some, entered, and closed the door behind her. Pausing what I was doing, slowly with some trepidation of what I might face, I turned around in order to face her. "Girl, I don't mean this as no kind of disrespect, but you are not my daughter. Knowing Leah and Jamaica, I suspect that the two of them cooked up something they shouldn't have been meddling with, and you've agreed to go along with them," she stated like these were facts. My eyes bugging out, I could not find words, and so nodded my head in agreement. "I cannot imagine what kind of family you've come from to prefer ours over your own," but whatever lessons the Great Spirit has for my daughter, I am grateful for how helpful and respectful you are." She took a deep breath and looked at me. "I will not tell and I will not interfere, irrelevant of the outcome, because whatever magic allowed the swap would not have done so if not meant for the greater good. So, out with it, girl, what's your name?" Hanging my head down some and unable to maintain eye contact, as I was afraid of her response, I whispered, "Bella," unwilling to lie to this woman. "Renee and Charlie's Isabella," she checked, after a few minutes of contemplation. "Yes, ma'am," I answered, still diligently studying the carpet. She smiled sadly. "Your manners and respect make sense, knowing that. It's good to know Renee raised you well, although I doubt being her daughter was easy, since she was ruled by her intuition more than any person I know, and often had no good sense." She briefly paused before asking me, "Mandy giving you trouble?" Clearly interested. Her knowledge of Renee floored me, but there was too much swimming in my head to even begin pondering her words. Instead, I answered, "Yes, impressed with her, but nothing I haven't had to handle before. Mean girls are all the same. I might even have made a new friend." She asked about me coming over next Friday. Mrs. White shook her head like the whole conversation belonged in the Twilight Zone, which it honestly did. "What's her name?" "Rose," I told her. Then, she smiled kindly. "Yes, that's fine." Keeping my eyes firmly on the carpet, and hoping she was willing to be an ally to me, I corrected, "I was as surprised by the swap as you are." She made some non-committable noises. After a few minutes of her standing there, she added, her tone softening, "If you and Jamerica were able to be friendly, it would be nice to see my daughter, even if she isn't herself." "I'll do my best," I promised, willing to give this woman almost anything as a thank you for her being so kind and understanding to me. She was a remarkable woman. Risking it, I lifted my head some, and glanced through my eyelashes towards her. Her features turned into something fierce, like lightning bolts might exit her eyes. "Anything you hear or learn in this family you can never utter, except to Quileutes. We don't allow pale faces into our histories, as they've used and twisted them into their own purposes." I nodded in understanding, before my face contorted as a potential problem came to mind. "What about the Cullens?" I checked, needing clarification, since one of the stories from last night was about them. "They're not really a pale face," she hedged, "so the same reasons for the restrictions do not apply. Nevertheless, they are not Quileute and therefore are not privy to our stories." She looked at me sternly and frowned. "They look pretty on the outside, but looks are deceiving. You need to stay clear of them. They are vagabonds, here today, gone tomorrow." It was amazing how she said so much, while also saying so little. "I will not speak of the stories to anyone who isn't Quileute," I promised. "You remember that, as there are consequences for broken vows, especially betraying the trust of another." At that her features changed once more, and she looked at me in a kind of mothering way. "With it just being you and Renee and then you and Charlie, I imagine that you're not used to taking care of more than yourself. I'll give you some more grace, this next week, but as long as you're here in this family, I'm going to need you to help out. That means going to bed on time, so you can get up in time to help with the boys. No more sleeping in, that includes tomorrow as we leave by 9 in the morning. Neither Renee nor Charlie are church-going people, so tomorrow will probably contain unexpected things for you. Try and not show it, if possible. The less questions people ask the better." "Yes, ma'am, and I'll work on contributing more," I vowed. She turned to leave and then looked at me once more, "And I'll teach you how to care for your hair and body." No swan would ever know about that. Smiling a little, I agreed, I would greatly appreciate the help. Evaluating me once more, she seemed to have a slight watery tint to her eyes, as she uttered, "Okay." Then, she turned and then under her breath repeated the sentiment. Shaking my head at what had just occurred, I decided that my mind was too full of her words and their implications to get any more homework done, so crawled into bed, and fell asleep with the possibility that she knew Renee when they were both young. Glad that I wouldn't need to try and fool Mrs. White anymore, I considered the consequences if Jamerica failed my classes. Tutoring Jamerica became my first reason for fulfilling Mrs. White's wish. It was the least I could do for her hospitality and acceptance. She definitely inspired me as someone I could admire to become in the future. Without doubt, Renee had some good points and I missed her fun ways, but imagining her in Mrs. White's place caused me to shiver in dread. At least I had one reasonable person in my corner. It was that assuring thought that allowed me to sleep soundly. Forced awake, I was resentful and grumpy. However, as the sleep wore off, my eyes caught purple. A huge smile spread across my face, and then only grew when I remembered what day it was and why I had set an alarm for a Saturday morning. Throwing the purple comforter off me, I was enthusiastically excited and jittery. Immediately I started getting ready, wanting to ensure that I would impress Mike when he picked me up. Bella had little makeup in her bathroom bag. I assumed that her dad didn't like her having makeup and that she hid it somewhere, but after examining every nook and cranny of Bella's room multiple times, I had found nothing. It made no sense to me. What kind of girl only has one mascara, one eyeliner, and one tip gloss? Her mother must be an unnatural woman and taught her to be the same was the only reasonable answer. Clearly, it was something to remedy in the future. The problem was money. I already knew the cheapest brands at the drugstore asked for a pretty penny. Perhaps I could speak to Chief Swan about giving me some cash. He was her father after all, and it was a parent's job to make sure their kids had what they needed. Not that my parents did that. Instead, my parents talked about things being tight and the cost of Grandma's funeral, and how expensive basics were. It seemed like an excuse, since Mandy's mother didn't work and she had more of everything than me. Despite the lack of what Bella had, I wanted to make the most of it. Her complexion was so different than what I was used to that it took multiple times to get a look that worked. Good thing I had set the alarm early enough to overcome these small hiccups. At the end, examining myself in mirror, I decided that it had come out well. Having been Mandy's best friend and staying over at her house all these years had actually helped, as she often talked about her makeup and stuff. I smirked at the idea of using Mandy's own techniques to demonstrate to Mike how much I cared about him and making sure he got the message that we were meant to be. Through all of my struggles to tame Bella's hair, it was obvious that she had terrible products for the bit of curl she did have. Nonetheless, using what I had heard Mandy's mother tell her and a bit of what my mother had taught me about her own hair, I had turned it into something slightly sultry. Putting on the bra and underwear I had purchased yesterday along with jeans and the new shirt, I examined myself in the mirror, deciding that the person looking back at me looked good. Trusting Leah's words that boys were primarily fueled by what they saw, I smiled confidently at myself, settling my nerves. As he had promised, Chief Swan had foregone his fishing trip in order to greet Mike. When I came downstairs, Chief Swan opened his mouth and seemed to choke a bit. "You look nice, Bells," he finally uttered. "Thanks," I told him nonchalantly, while inwardly proud of myself. Whatever nerves had remained were cooled by his compliment and reaction. Hopefully my appearance would have an even greater impact on Mike. I was almost finished eating my breakfast of eggs and toast when there was a knock on the front door. Chief Swan got it and invited Mike in. It sounded like an interrogation and some threats, but since it was about the same as my father would have done, I ignored it, giving Chief Swan this, and enjoying just a little the ways in which he reminded me of my father. It was a little sad, since I missed him more than I had expected, but nothing that would get me down. I ended up washing my dish just about the time when their voices became quiet. Drying my hands, I went out to greet Mike, letting him sweat a little, filling with confidence that I could use this body to show him how great we would be together. His jaw dropped when his eyes caught me. It took him a few minutes to find his voice. "You look nice, Bella." "Thanks," I told him. "Remember what I said?" Chief Swan stated threateningly. "Yes, sir," Mike stuttered back. Grabbing my coat, I made sure my keys were in my bag. Opening it a little to check that I had everything, my eyes caught a can of mace. Shaking my head a little and smiling, I looked at Chief Swan and told him, "Thanks for the can." He grinned, which stole a little of the seriousness he was trying to project to Mike. "Sure thing," he replied. "You remember your lessons?" "Yes, sir," I answered with a genuine smile, remembering the ones my dad had given me. Mike was a gentleman, who after putting back on his own coat, held the door open for me, and then the car door. "I was thinking the cafe in Port Angeles," Mike told me. "Sounds good," I agreed, making sure to sound exuberant. A fancier place than a cafe would have been a better indication that everything was working to plan, since Leah told me that you could tell how much a guy is into you by how much they're trying to impress. Then again, this was a first date and breakfast. Those were more dinner types of places. I was confident that he would pull out all the stops eventually. After getting out of the neighborhood and onto the road to Port Angeles, Mike put his hand down between us. Trying to be casual and not in too much of a hurry, I put my hand on top of his. "How's that game with Eric going?" I asked, disliking the silence between us. For the rest of the ride Mike rambled on about it. I made all the right sounds at all of his pauses. When we got to Port Angeles he parked and came around and opened my door. I smiled at his efforts to be a gentleman. Chief Swan and my dad indicated this showed that a guy cared, which is what I wanted. We went into the cafe. It was cute on the outside with little Eiffel towers and cute funny signs along with adorable images of coffee and pancakes. Yet, everything seemed a little faded, like it was a little rundown. "Can we get the table by the window?" I whispered to Mike. He shrugged, but then asked the host for it when we arrived at her podium. Fortunately, the table I had eyed wasn't taken yet, and as luck would have it, she took us right to it. I mean, it was right next to the window, so she'd have to be dense to have seated us elsewhere. Even still, it was nice to get what I hoped for. Its location made me a little chilly, but the perfect position for everyone to see me out with Mike, so I made sure to make it seem like it was ideal and touch him a ton, while expressing my gratitude. I even told her thank you. Once we ordered, I asked Mike, "Do you like to people watch?" He looked confused. "It's a game my mom and me used to play when I was younger. You pick a person or group of people and tell a story about them, who they are, what they're doing, how they're feeling, anything," I explained. "Shall I go first?" I questioned in response to his hesitant look. "Sure," he answered and tried to look like he didn't care. Waiting a few seconds, I spotted a woman pushing a stroller. She had shoulder-length brown straight hair and an oval face. She was of a medium height. She was scowling, dressed in jeans, rain boots, and a heavy wintry raincoat. The stroller looked like the overused kind, like she had bought it at Goodwill or something. "That woman over there with the stroller," I started. He hummed like he saw her, so I continued. "Before she left her house she had a terrible fight with her boyfriend, who doesn't make enough money, thus the second-hand stroller. She had threatened to become a prostitute if he cannot provide for her and their child. When she was at the store picking up a few essential items, she put her son down on the ground. He crawled away. While in her angry state she put the bag of flour in the stroller. So right now she's still mad, pushing around a bag of flour, while her son is crying, a lost kid at the store." Mike's chuckles turned into laughter and then a hard belly laugh. It took him a few minutes to calm down before he uttered, "Oh, that was good, Bella. Okay, my turn." He took a few minutes clearly trying to look for someone that would fit his imagination. "That guy over there," he pointed to a 30-something wannabe with long black hair pulled back in a ponytail, a narrow face with a pointed chin, jewelry littering his face, black pants, long black leather jacket, and black combat boots. He works at the record and gaming store, and is a super dork, but dresses like some punk rocker to keep people from making fun of him. He just had the best night of his life, as he lost his virginity to the stud of a man following behind him. At those words my eyes moved to the giant of a person walking a few steps behind. Sure, there was a light drizzle, but I was almost certain that the mammoth of a man was none other than Emmett Cullen. At even the possibility that might be the case I started busting out laughing. But since they're in the closet, afraid of losing their jobs due to the gossip, they're walking as close as they dare. It took me many minutes to slow my breath. "That was a good one, Mike," I praised him, taking his hand that had been resting on the table and covering it with mine. "Thanks for that, I needed a good laugh." "Sure," he said softly, staring at me. Out of nowhere he blurted out, "I'm really glad you said yes." "I'm glad you asked," I replied. "I think you're really hot," he told me, his words blending together. "And I'd like us to make a go of it, you know, be a couple and everything." "Really?" I checked, working at not squealing. "I'm a lucky guy if you say yes," he told me. "Yes," I answered with a smile. "I'd like to be your girl. That means no going on dates with anyone else, right?" he asked with a tone like he was threatening me. "Of course," I agreed easily. "I said that I'd be yours." His whole body seemed to relax, and he smiled warmly at me. "Good, good." There were a few minutes of silence. Wanting to fill it, I wondered, What time do you have to start your shift? He looked at his watch. I have about 3 more hours. Smiling at him, I replied, that's good. Almost right as he said that the food had arrived. We both started eating, so the silence between us seemed more normal. As Mike finished, he chuckled a little. Guess I was hungrier than I thought. Smiling at him, since I had my mouth full, I continued to eat while he complained about the different teachers and our homework. I agreed with him and added my own comments. Once I was finished he seemed restless, he paid for the meal, and we left. I thought we'd walk the pier, he suggested. Sounds good, I agreed, glad that he clued me into why he had wanted to leave the cafe. He took my hand and we started veering towards the water. Despite us both wearing gloves, my heart was beating so fast and it was hard not to smile from ear to ear. I might as well have been walking on clouds. When we got to the guardrail, we both leaned over it. My hands were in cloth gloves that only slightly helped against the temperature of the metal, as I moved them back and forth a little. The rail wasn't smooth, because at times I could feel little divots or rivets under my fingertips. It was a comforting thing, as this rail had been like this since I was a little girl and my father had brought me here for the first time. My reflections and remembering my father brought my mind to my purpose. Jessica is mad that we're dating, I told Mike with some seriousness, so he would know this was no joking matter. Yeah, he asked, sounding surprised. I said I would be yours and not date others. I expect the same. You make sure Jessica knows that you picked me and you're not interested in her, I stated emphatically, so he would know I was serious. Makes sense, he replied, but his tone was distant. Afraid that I had put some idea in his head and might be already losing him, I moved in closer to him, put his arms around me, and placed myself in front of him. His breath, which had turned rapid, was on my neck and down my coat, as my jacket's hood had fallen down in my movement. I shivered from the sensation in a pleasant way, even though it had chilled me slightly. From my toes to the top of my head I felt like a Christmas tree sparkling and shining in every way. My movement must have triggered something in him, because he halted and moved his pelvis away from me a little. Taking his hands, I wrapped them around me. Our arms were intertwined with his left hand resting on the top of my right breast. He moved himself so his pelvis was out more and his head leaned on mine protecting me from the drizzle. Jessica is a sloppy second to you, Bella Swan, he muttered into my ear. I might be a jock, but I'm not stupid. Then, I don't have to worry about her being put in her place. I checked. I'll make sure she gets the message, he assured me. Good, I told him, beyond pleased. We stood there a few more minutes before he asked me to skip stones with him. Wanting to be agreeable, I said yes. For most of our remaining time at the waterfront we laughed and had fun as a result of his suggested activity. It was far better than I had imagined. Twice he had wrapped his arms around me in the guise of showing me how get the rock to skip multiple times. Each time that being a Christmas tree feeling would return. My lips tingled and my feet were warm. It was delightful and suggested that what would come next would be even better. We walked the streets some, looking into shops, going into the comic book store he wanted to check out, and when his time was running out, he drove me home. I had a great time, Bella, he told me at my doorstep. Me too, I agreed, then going onto my tippy toes, I kissed his cheek, and then leaned into a hug. My dad's probably watching, otherwise I'd kiss you. Better not get shot, he agreed and chuckled. Moving a step back from me, he told me, we'll have to do this again. For sure, I agreed, imagining what it would be like to kiss him and more. See you Monday, he promised. Monday, I repeated, disappointed and excited at the same time. When I closed the door behind me, Chief Swan had the TV muted, so I knew he was serious, and questioned, how was your date? Delightful, I answered with a huge smile. I gave him the highlights and detailed what a gentleman Mike had been. He better remain so, he threatened, and then went back to watching sports. It seemed like he was done speaking his piece, so I let him be. I was too jazzed up to study, so did some laundry and cleaning. A few hours later I ran out of chores, even after organizing her clothes and closet, so reluctantly started on math. Eventually I gave up trying to make sense of it and asked Chief Swan for help. You've never needed it before, he challenged me, looking at me concerned. It's this concept that totally has been confusing, I offered as an explanation, trying to cover quickly, noting to never ask him again or anyone who knew Bella's skills. He grunted, but said no more on the issue, and instead started trying to explain. He might be good at teaching people how to be cops, as I had heard my father speak highly of him more than once, but he sucked at explaining math. After an hour or so, he admitted, "It's been a while since I used these things." "Then why'd I have to learn them?" I whined. "Who knows?" He replied with a smile, "But you do. Is there tutoring offerings at the school?" "There was in my day." "Probably," I agreed, "but I don't want to go. I'll try and figure it out." "Nothing wrong admitting you need help," he told me, after I had already started walking away. Then after a brief pause, he added, "I'll order pizza." "Thanks," I answered. Giving up on math, I started on biology. That went worse. When food arrived, I paused my homework and ate with him in front of the TV. At a commercial, he told me, while his eyes were on the screen, "You dating is a part of being a junior, Bells, but I'm too young to be a grandpa." I almost choked on my bite. "I'd rather you keep yourself from boys altogether, but if you and Mike, or anyone else, start to get serious, then I can take you to the doctor. I'd rather you take something than ruin your future with a kid. You're a bright girl, Bells. You deserve to go off to college and a baby will get in the way of that," he warned. By the end he resembled a tomato. "No babies," I repeated. "Got it. Good," he stated tersely, with a sigh of relief. He was far easier going about the whole thing than my own dad. I think my father would have whipped me before taking me to the doctors for birth control. Despite his warning, as I lay in bed, my eyes closed, my mind reviewed my date with Mike, and I fell asleep with the delightful image of him touching me under my clothes. The sun was just beginning to rise when Alice and I returned to the house. She went to find Jasper, and I went to my room. After some reading and brushing up on my quileute, as much as could be found anyway, I was restless. Having the urge to compose, I went down to the piano and began playing. Imagining Bella's soul swapped and waking up in a strange body, generated images and feelings of fear, yet she behaved so bravely. As if it wanted to have its tale told, a melody came forth from my fingers of their own accord. It had tones of a storm mixed with all of what I had learned about Bella thus far. Keeping in my mind when she had mentally requested to be left alone, I ended the notes and opened my eyes, even though the piece seemed unfinished. "That's a lovely composition, Edward," Esme gushed. Nodding at her in appreciation, I went to start again, when she asked, "Inspired by someone?" Looking over at her, she stood about 10 feet from me, smiling from ear to ear. I tried to decipher what was causing her question and odd behavior. First Carlyle's strangeness and then Esme's combined into a quandary in my mind, yet an actual question couldn't even be formed. Mouthing at her, "Bella," so the others wouldn't hear, she replied, "She must be a lovely girl to have such sweet notes in the midst of her turmoil." Her description was exactly what I had been trying to capture, although I was struck by the fact that she knew that so easily. "It's been a long time since you've composed, and she's the only new thing in your life." It wasn't a hard guess. Dropping my head to the side in acceptance, she then wondered, "Are you carrying her scent?" "The bodies," I mouthed. She smiled knowingly. Carlyle suggested desensualization. I grinned like, "Of course. Yes, that seems like the solution Carlyle would suggest. He is predictable, isn't he?" Smiling in acknowledgement of her statement, we both knew it was the case. "Keep playing. I was enjoying it," she requested, so I did. The next time I opened my eyes, the parts one had written were richer in tones and seemed to convey the complexity of the moments better to me. The sun was close to setting, and from the sounds of it Jasper and Emmett were playing their complicated version of chess. Rising to return to my room, Emmett bellowed, "Which human girl are you keeping tokens from?" I opened and closed my mouth multiple times in my outrage, trying to find a suitable response. "The girl I'm trying to not murder," I finally answered tersely, feeling Jasper's calming influence. "Something to remember her by, then," Emmett teased. Jasper chuckled while his thoughts indicated that he had found humor in the ridiculousness of Emmett's statement. "Desensualization," I retorted, trying to manage my irritation at him. "Sure, that's what all the kids say nowadays," he threw back at me. Then, even though I saw the intent in his mind, he was in front of me. He tried to grab me, wanting to see for himself the article of clothing I was carrying around. Emmett, not in my house, Esme warned from her office. Emmett waved towards outside. Moving in that direction, I tried to determine my next move. As soon as we were far enough from the house, I charged at him. We tussled, and although he didn't get in any blows, I did a few times. When I successfully won the exchange, he huffed, and I ran off to find some deer. His antagonizing me, although annoying me, had actually helped me exert the excess energy within me as a result of all day fighting my instincts to go track her down and empty her of blood. The image of her jugular beneath my teeth changed to her bosoms in my hands even more quickly than last time. Then, in a surprising twist, it changed to Jamaica's body. The more that my thoughts dwelt on Bella's character, based on what her thoughts had indicated, the more my body responded in carnal lust for her. It was a strange idea that I was sexually attracted to someone's character, but if vampire mates were two souls finding each other, then it made sense. However, I was repulsed by the idea of finding my mate in a human girl, particularly one so young and having so much of her human life in front of her. Alice's question vibrated in my mind. Clearly the answer was yes, but it wasn't to her body as much as to her soul. Her soul, even in a different body, seemed to excite me and draw me in. Allowing my mind to imagine the body she presently dwelt in and evaluating myself, I found, in the most basic of analysis, it was no more or less attractive than the one at the Swan House. It wasn't the outward appearance that mattered to me. If I were so shallow as to be pulled in by that, I would have allowed Tanya to educate me decades ago. Yet, I could not deny the reality that Bella's present body would have been objectionable in my era, simply due to the Negro aspect of her inheritance. Then correcting myself, I had to add the Indian part, as both were unacceptable in a partner back in my youth. Going to my meadow, I laid in the grass and considered how ridiculous that notion had been. In my years of hunting humans there had actually been more European-descended men that I had murdered than any other ethnicity. The color of a person's skin didn't shape their character, except in how they responded to the discrimination and racism they experienced. Over and over I had witnessed European-descended men treat Negro men and women as if they were cattle, only for the Negro individuals to not retaliate. I knew from their thoughts that their lack of reaction was mostly out of fear of the repercussions, but it nevertheless often impressed me. Then, on a rare occasion I had come across a Negro male being violent. It often was as if he was lost in a rage of past events. There had been only one exception in all my human hunting years where a Negro's state of mind caused me to indulge without pause and further investigation. During the civil rights protests, I had often watched them on television, or if Alice had promised a cloudy day, gone to witness. Through exposing myself to their voices and cries to change, I had begun to attempt to see the world from their experiences, which were in such contrast to my own human upbringing. My human opinions of other humans who were not from my class or race were one of the few things that I was grateful to have lost during my burning. Yet, I found myself hesitant to pursue even a friendship with the soul in Jamaica's body. Examining myself more deeply, there was absolutely a desire to keep her from my world and the truth of my nature, simply because the knowledge was a death sentence according to the Volturi. However, there seemed to be a remnant from my human years that was also hesitant. A relationship with someone of another race was taboo and meant being shamed and rejected by the community. Certainly I couldn't imagine any of my family caring about the quantity of melanin in someone's skin. They would care, well, Rosalie and Jasper would care that she was human, full stop. Jasper's years with Maria resulted in him seeing no differences in humans, as they were all food. Rosalie resented and envied all humans with little discrimination. The only bias she had was against rapists, pedophiles, and abusers. In contrast, Carlisle, Esme, Alice, and Emmett would probably each encourage a friendship, albeit each of them would likely have different reasons. Then, there was the reality that the body Bella inhabited was of Quileute ancestry. Without doubt, that would be the element that would create the most objections from the family. To befriend a human from a divorce with no siblings was one thing. To befriend a Quileute was another altogether. Uncertain of what to do, I tried to imagine a path forward. Staying clear of her seemed the most prudent, but even the thought brought me sadness. It was an impossible situation with no answer in sight. Waking up before someone knocked on my door demanding I get up felt like an accomplishment. Even before my eyes could open, the previous night's conversation with Mrs. White flashed through my mind. Believing I had an ally with her, I went and found her making breakfast. This time I remained in my nightclothes. Calling her name softly, as to not startle her, she turned and smiled gently at me with sadness in her eyes. "Ma's going to have to do." "Yes, ma'am," I replied before asking her, "What should I wear?" "Cover everything up, but casual, not a hoodie though, like you seem to like to hide yourself in," she instructed. "Okay," I told her, grateful for her instructions, and went back upstairs. Mr. White could be heard helping the boys. When I reappeared in the kitchen she eyed me once and uttered, "Good enough." She seemed sad. "I'm sorry for your sadness," I told her, unsure of what else to say, while I grabbed cutlery to set the table. "Nothing about you," she assured me, "just sad that my baby girl chose not to cling to her family in her time of need. It's hard, no doubt about it, to stay rooted in our heritage when everyone and everything around you tells you that there's something wrong with you. That's why the res is such a refuge. I'm grieving because she made a poor choice, and she's big enough that I cannot protect her from the consequences." Unsure of what to say, I just listened and helped her serve the food. "You know Charlie has Quileute blood in him," she told me, her tone changing completely. "One of his grandmothers was half Quileute. You're technically related to the Blacks, as Charlie's Quileute ancestor was the sister of Chief Ephraim Black. And Renee is related to the Yulee bloodline, who before the colonists invaded were honored by the tribe as powerful shamans. Although our stories are forbidden to be told to strangers, and you have not been raised in the Quileute ways, I am relieved that at least you are not completely removed from us." I did not know that, I told her in awe of how she knew more about me than I did. Both Charlie and Renee were not raised Quileute, as their ancestors chose to hide themselves, much as Jamaica is wanting to do, she answered sadly. "Even though it's in different quantities, both you and Jamaica carry the magic of the Quileute blood." She couldn't have known that a spell as powerful as soul swapping would need magic in both lineages. If not for your genetics, she might have chalked doing the spell down to something silly and never tried again. It's ironic, as much as it's sad. She spoke about magic so factually that I found myself inclined to believe her. If the swap hadn't happened to me, her belief that the Quileutes have magic in their blood would have sounded ridiculous to me. But since it had worked, her premise seemed like a reasonable explanation. Truthfully, no other explanation made as much sense. Didn't change the truth that these conclusions had more in common with a novel than real life. Yet, since I was living the impossibility, I grabbed onto her words tightly. If her theories were correct, then the spell would work on Emily, since as a cousin of Leah's she would likely have whatever magic had allowed the transfer. Her certainty in magic shifted my mental starting point, which once my mind had digested the alteration altered my fundamental basis for reality. These thoughts immediately brought mine to my initial conversation with Leah. There was a lot that she said which had bothered me. How they had so casually thrown away my life, hadn't considered my feelings, and generally had been self-centered bitches continued to rile me up. However, the more I had ruminated, the more shame had filled me. The uncomfortable truth was that my anger at them made me into a hypocrite. With all my belief in the ultimate love of Romeo and Juliet, when I attempted to step outside of the consequences I was paying, I couldn't help but see Jamaica's actions as romantic. The real problem I had, then, wasn't how she was willing to do anything to be with the one, or how she was willing to sacrifice everything for him. What was really boiling my blood was that her romance was at my expense. Sure, I had been mostly enjoying my time with the Whites in the last days, but Jamaica and Leah stealing away my life from me for Jamaica's gain, romantic or not, stung. For the first time, I thought about Romeo and Juliet's actions from their family's view. Did Mrs. White want Jamaica to be happy, despite the cost? It seemed, thus far, that Mrs. White had a very different view of love than mine. She talked about family and heritage. Mr. White talked about family love and being there for each other. Hadn't all the stories I liked conveyed that happiness is found most prominently romantically? The question that had uncovered my hypocrisy was, what would I have done in her place? Would I have broken my parents' hearts and been willing to sacrifice everything for the right guy? I didn't like my answers, and as much as my mind attempted to downplay my own truth, it stared at me in the face hauntingly. Would Jamaica be able to live with the guilt of the cost of her choices? Maybe she could. Maybe she was the kind of person who did a thing, and then didn't think about it after that. Was she the kind of person who believed that the ends justified the means? I hoped Jamerica was as pleased as she appeared at school, especially if Leah had been correct. The price for her desires was high. She might get her happily ever after, but having to live with the damage was something else. Certainly the price I was paying, even with the unexpected gifts, wasn't worth it. Then it dawned on me that maybe it wasn't too high for her, since she wasn't the one having to live with the consequences. She got her man while her mother suffered, and my body and whatever future it held was stolen from me. Unfortunately, I had to admit that I was the end justified the means kind of person, although I imagined myself more selfless than her. But if someone I loved was at risk, what boundary wouldn't I cross to save them? The lack of knowing if I had limits in a situation such as that was disconcerting. What was the price of a switch back? Who would pay it? Would it be worth it? So that's for today. We will continue in next part.